Most men spend their entire lives walking away from themselves in the direction of what they want. The mechanics of this error are invisible to those inside it. It presents as effort, as ambition, as the responsible refusal to be passive in the face of desire. But James Allen identifies it as the precise mechanism that perpetuates the emptiness it sets out to resolve. A tower that sends crews into the wilderness to search for music will return empty every night. Not because the music does not exist, but because music is not found by searching. It arrives in response to a signal. The second tower does not send anyone anywhere. It transmits, emitting a clean, powerful frequency into the invisible fabric of the air. And what corresponds to that frequency floods back to it instantly, without pursuit, without a single step taken into the dark. James Allen teaches that most human beings are the first tower. They spend their entire lives walking out into the wilderness of circumstance, searching for abundance, chasing the sound of a prosperity they can hear in their imagination, but never seem to find in their hands. And the tragedy Allen identifies is not that they search too little. It is that they search at all, because the only assignment they were ever given was not to seek the signal, but to become it. The seeker's posture is one of lack. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a gentle observation. It is a diagnosis. Every act of searching begins with a confession, spoken not in words, but in the architecture of the act itself. I do not have what I need, and it is somewhere out there beyond me, waiting to be found. James Allen identifies this posture, this fundamental orientation of the seeker, as the precise mechanism that perpetuates the emptiness it sets out to resolve. The searching does not approach abundance. The searching broadcasts at full power the signal of a man who does not possess abundance. And that broadcast is the governing fact. That is the emission the universe receives and to which it responds. Consider what this means with full precision. You cannot simultaneously seek abundance and emit abundance. They are not merely different strategies. They are opposite signals, contradictory transmissions that cannot coexist in the same moment. The man on his hands and knees in the dirt, looking for wealth, is not approaching wealth. He is demonstrating, through every fiber of his orientation, the lived reality of a man without it. His body language, his anxious thought, his restless search, all of it constitutes a frequency. And that frequency is not the frequency of a man who commands. It is the frequency of a man who lacks. The universe, perfectly faithful to its own laws, does not evaluate the intention behind the search. It reads the signal, and it responds with mechanical, impersonal precision by returning that frequency to him as his daily experience. This is the first and most devastating recognition that James Allen's teaching demands. That your conditions are not happening to you. They are happening from you. The wilderness you walk through night after night is not indifferent to you. It is an exact reflection of the transmission you are generating from within. The lack you encounter is not a problem to be solved by searching harder, planning more carefully, or acquiring better maps of the terrain. It is a problem of signal quality. And a problem of signal quality cannot be resolved by walking further into the dark. It can only be resolved by returning to the tower and changing what is being transmitted. What you will encounter in what follows is not encouragement. It is not a method for improving your attitude or reframing your circumstances. It is something older and more demanding than either of those things. We will dismantle the seeking reflex at its root, not by replacing it with another reflex, but by exposing the precise law that makes seeking not merely ineffective, but structurally self-defeating. We will place before you James Allen's frequency secret in its full severity. The law that states, without qualification, that abundance is not a destination to be reached, but a signal to be emitted, and that the man who has not understood this distinction will spend his entire life working against the very force he is attempting to invoke. The distinction matters more than most men are prepared to admit. It is the difference between a life of perpetual pursuit and a life of effortless command. It is the difference between the tower that sends its crew into the dark and the tower that simply transmits. Allen's teaching is not asking you to believe something new about the world. It is asking you to recognize something that has always been true about the world and about you. Something that has been operating in your life with absolute fidelity, whether you knew it or not, governing every condition that has come to you, calling to you everything that has ever arrived at your door. We will show you precisely how to become the transmission that commands prosperity to arrive, not as luck, not as reward distributed by a capricious universe to its favored few, not as the spoils of superior effort or sharper strategy, but as the inevitable response of a system obeying its own laws. The universe has laws. Signal and response is one of them. And when you understand this law not merely intellectually, but as the governing principle of your inner life, the searching stops, not because you have given up, but because you have finally understood that the thing you were searching for has never been waiting for you to find it. It has been waiting for you to emit the frequency that calls it home. James Allen teaches that every human being is, at every moment, broadcasting a field of thought into the invisible fabric of existence. This is the foundational architecture of his system, and it must be understood not as poetic imagery, but as the literal description of a mechanism at work in you right now, in this moment, regardless of whether you are aware of it. Your inner life, the aggregate of your habitual beliefs, your emotional baseline, your private assumptions about your own worth, your deepest convictions about what is available to you and what is not sealed inside you. It radiates outward. It occupies space. It meets the world before your words do, before your actions do, before your plans or your intentions or your conscious efforts have had the opportunity to present themselves. You are always already transmitting. The content of this field is not determined by what you say you believe. This is a critical precision that Allen insists upon, and it is the point at which most men's understanding of these laws collapses. The field is determined by the dominant quality of your thought, the frequency at which your consciousness most habitually vibrates when no performance is required of it. It is what you think in the dark, in the quiet, in the unguarded moment between sleep and waking. It is the tone of your inner dialogue when no one is listening. It is the assumption that sits beneath all your other assumptions. The bedrock belief about yourself and your place in the order of things that colors every perception you have and every action you take without ever being consciously examined. That belief is your signal, and your signal is your life. The universe does not evaluate your effort or read your resume or assess the nobility of your intentions. Allen is absolute on this point. The formless substance from which all conditions are shaped does not have a preference for the hard-working over the idle, or for the virtuous over the flawed. It operates by correspondence. It returns to each man what he is, not what he wants, not what he deserves, not what he has worked for, but what he is at the level of his dominant emission. This is not a system that rewards or punishes. It is a system that reflects. It is a mirror of infinite fidelity, and it does not lie, and it cannot be fooled. And it has been reflecting you back to yourself with absolute accuracy every single day of your life. To understand this fully, consider the implications for the man who spends his days in the active pursuit of prosperity. He plans, he acts, he applies himself. And yet the conditions of his life remain unchanged, or improve only marginally, or improve temporarily, and then contract back to their original state. From the outside, this looks like bad luck, or insufficient effort, or an unkind world. From the inside of Alan's framework, it looks entirely different. It looks like a man transmitting at one frequency while attempting to receive at another. The effort is real. The planning is real. But underneath both, in the silent basement of his psychology, the signal remains unchanged. A signal of doubt, of fundamental unworthiness, of a man who does not quite believe in the marrow of his conviction rather than the surface of his statements, that abundance is the natural response to his existence. The field of thought, Alan teaches, is not an accessory to a man's life. It is not one factor among many. It is the primary cause. It precedes all visible conditions, as a whisper precedes a shout. Every external circumstance that arrives in a man's life was first drawn to him by the nature of his field, by the quality of what he was transmitting in the period before that circumstance took form. The relationship between the field and the condition is not probabilistic, not approximate, not subject to the interference of chance. It is lawful. It operates the way gravity operates. Not sometimes, not under certain conditions, but always, without exception, with a fidelity so complete that no case has ever escaped it in the recorded history of human experience. What this means, practically and precisely, is that the work of changing your conditions begins not in the visible world, but in the invisible one. Not in the market, not in the network, not in the improved strategy or the better opportunity, but in the field, in the signal, in the dominant quality of what you are broadcasting at the deepest, most habitual level of your consciousness. This is what Alan means when he says that circumstances do not make the man. They reveal him. They are the broadcast made visible. They are the signal made solid. They are the inner life translated, without remainder and without distortion, into the terms of physical reality. One of the most unsettling aspects of this teaching, and it is meant to unsettle because comfort is not the purpose of this knowledge, is that it removes every external excuse. If the field determines the condition, and the field is yours alone, generated within you, emanating from your own habitual thinking, then no external force can be assigned the authority over your conditions that you have perhaps been granting it. Not the economy, not your origins, not the behavior of other people, not the accidents of fortune, not the distribution of opportunity. These things exist. Alan does not deny them, but they exist as conditions that a man with a certain signal passes through without being stopped, while a man with a different signal is blocked by them absolutely. The field determines what is visible to you, what is accessible to you, what reaches you, and what does not. Think of two men standing in the same room, surrounded by the same objects. One man, whose field is calibrated to abundance and worth, perceives the room as full of possibility, sees the tools, the connections, the potential encoded in every surface and conversation. The other man, whose field broadcasts limitation and lack, stands in the same space and perceives only obstacles, only evidence for the hopelessness of his position. They are not seeing different rooms. They are seeing through different signals, and what each man acts upon, what each man recognizes as opportunity, what each man finds available to him. All of this is downstream of the field, not upstream from it. The signal does not follow the conditions. The conditions follow the signal. This is the point at which Alan's teaching becomes not merely philosophical, but ruthlessly practical. If you wish to know why your conditions are what they are, you do not look outward. You examine the field. You ask with genuine honesty, not with the defensive reflexes of a man who does not wish to be implicated in his own predicament, but with the clear-eyed discipline of a man who wants to know the truth. What is the dominant quality of my habitual thought? What is the emotional register I inhabit most consistently? What are the unexamined assumptions that sit beneath my conscious beliefs and color everything I perceive? What, in the quiet and unperformed hours of my private life, am I actually transmitting? The answers to those questions are already visible in your conditions. This is Alan's most precise and most demanding claim. Your life, as it currently stands, is the most accurate diagnostic instrument available to you. You do not need to guess what your signal is. Your conditions tell you the quality of your relationships, the nature of the opportunities that reach you, the character of the setbacks you encounter, the pattern that repeats itself across different circumstances and different periods of your life. All of this is not a collection of random events. It is a portrait of your transmission. Read your life the way a technician reads a signal, not with shame, not with excitement, but with precision. And you will know exactly what field you have been broadcasting. And knowing this, really knowing it as a law rather than a preference, changes the nature of the task entirely. The task is no longer to try harder, to search further, to improve the strategy or refine the approach. The task is to change the signal. It is to go to the source, to the habitual quality of the inner life, and to alter, through sustained and deliberate discipline, the frequency at which the field operates. This is not a quick process. Alan never suggests that it is. Character is not rebuilt in a single act of will. The field does not transform overnight because a man has read about it and found it compelling. The transformation is the product of consistent, unglamorous, daily inner work. The kind of work that happens in private, without witnesses, without immediate visible reward, without the encouragement of circumstances that have not yet caught up with the new signal. But it is the only work that matters. Every other form of effort, every external strategy, every plan, every pursuit is downstream of this one. A man who changes his signal changes everything, not immediately, not all at once, not in a way that can be calculated in advance, but with the same inexorability with which a change in transmission changes what a tower receives. The field shifts, the frequency rises, the signal clarifies, and then the world, obeying its own laws, begins to return something different. Not because the world has become kinder, because the broadcast has become clearer, because the tower is finally emitting the signal that calls abundance home instead of the signal that searches for it in the dark. Alan places no limit on what a man whose signal is clean and steady can call into his experience. The formless substance, he teaches, is not finite. It is not a resource that runs low, not a reservoir that can be depleted by the demands of many men drawing from it simultaneously. It is infinite, not as an aspiration, but as a structural fact about the nature of creative substance. And infinite substance responds to a clear signal without reserve. This is not generosity on the part of the universe. It is mechanics. The signal goes out. The response comes back. The strength of the response corresponds to the clarity of the signal. No other variable is ultimately determinative. Not time, not circumstance, not the opinion of other men, not the record of what has come before. The signal is the primary cause. Everything else, absolutely everything else, is a subsequent effect. The architecture of emission, then, is not a feature of certain gifted or fortunate men. It is the condition of every human being, without exception. The question is never whether you are transmitting. You are always transmitting. The question is only whether what you are transmitting corresponds to the life you have the capacity to inhabit. The life that is, in Alan's terms, the natural expression of your highest and most developed nature. Most men never ask this question because they do not know the question exists. They have been taught to look outward for causes, to assign responsibility to circumstances, to treat their conditions as the primary reality rather than as the derivative one. Alan's teaching asks you to reverse this assumption entirely, to recognize that the field precedes the form, that the signal precedes the condition, and that the mastery of your transmission is the single most consequential act available to a human being. There is a frequency at which abundance does not resist a rival. This is not a mystical claim. It is the logical consequence of understanding how fields of force relate to one another. A radio signal does not ask the receiver whether it is welcome. It does not negotiate or persuade. It arrives at the receiver that is tuned to its frequency and nowhere else, with a precision that is absolute and without appeal. James Allen maps the frequency of abundance with the same precision, and what he identifies is not what most men expect. It is not excitement. It is not the charged enthusiasm of a man who believes he is on the verge of a breakthrough. It is not hope, which is a condition that still contains within it the acknowledgement that the outcome is uncertain. And it is emphatically not desperation, which is merely the seeking reflex operating at maximum intensity. The frequency of command is something altogether different and altogether more difficult to reach, which is precisely why so few men manage to sustain it. Allen describes the commanding frequency as the calm, settled emission of a mind that has arrived at certainty. Not through external validation, not through evidence supplied by circumstances, but through a deep and unshakable alignment with the nature of law. The man who transmits at this frequency has resolved, at the level of his habitual consciousness, the question of his own worth. He does not raise it again every morning to check whether the answer has changed. He does not look to his bank account or his social standing or the opinions of his peers to calibrate his sense of what he is entitled to receive from the universe. He knows, with the quiet, unperformed certainty of a man who has examined the law and accepted its terms, that the universe does not withhold from those who have become the appropriate signal. This knowledge is not a belief he holds. It is a state he occupies. And the state, not the belief, is what transmits. The distinction between occupying a state and holding a belief is one of the most important precisions in Allen's entire system. A belief is a cognitive position, something a man can adopt through reasoning, through persuasion, through the accumulation of evidence. A state is something more fundamental. It is the quality of consciousness from which all his perceptions, reactions, and assumptions spontaneously arise. A man can believe in abundance on the surface of his mind, while his state, his actual, habitual frequency, broadcasts the opposite. This is the condition of most men who have encountered these teachings and yet remain unchanged by them. They have acquired new beliefs without transforming their state. They have updated their philosophy without altering their signal. And the universe, being indifferent to philosophy, continues to respond to the signal. To understand what the commanding frequency actually feels like from the inside. Because this is knowledge that must be inhabited, not merely described. Consider what it is not. It is not the feeling of striving towards something. It is not the feeling of working to bring about what does not yet exist. It is not the feeling of hope or optimism or confident anticipation, all of which carry within them the implication of a gap. A distance between where you are and where you wish to be. The commanding frequency is, paradoxically, the frequency of a man who has ceased to experience that gap, not because he is deluded about his circumstances, not because he has achieved his desired conditions in the visible world, but because, at the level of his dominant consciousness, he has closed the gap between what he is and what those conditions require of him. He has become, inwardly, the man his conditions are the natural expression of. And in becoming that man, he has also become the signal that calls those conditions into form. This is Alan's most penetrating insight into the mechanics of command. And it is the one that most completely separates his teaching from every superficial form of positive thinking. The man who is told to think about what he wants and believe it will come is given incomplete instruction. He is told to aim at the target without being told that the issue is not the aim, but the instrument. The instrument is the state. The instrument is the frequency. And the frequency is not produced by thinking about what you want. It is produced by becoming the quality of being that your desired conditions are the natural expression of. You do not attract abundance by thinking about abundance. You command it by becoming, at the level of your habitual state, the kind of being from whom abundance would naturally and inevitably flow. Consider a man of genuine inner mastery. A man whose thoughts are ordered, whose reactions are governed, whose private life is conducted with the same discipline as his public one. Such a man does not pursue opportunities with the anxious energy of one who fears they will escape. Opportunities detect him. They arrive at his signal because his signal is at the frequency that the formless substance recognizes as aligned with the principle of growth and expansion. This is not fortune, it is correspondence. The universe is not favoring him, it is obeying him in the only way the universe ever obeys anyone, which is by responding to what they are, not to what they want. Think also about what happens in the presence of such a man. How people feel drawn to him before he has done anything to attract them. How conversations orient themselves around him. How resources seem to move in his direction without visible effort on his part. This is not charisma in the social sense, not the product of trained behavior or cultivated impression. It is the effect of a clean and powerful signal on the minds and dispositions of those who come within its range. People are, themselves, fields of thought. And fields interact. A powerful signal does not merely transmit into empty space, it influences adjacent signals, draws them into alignment, creates the conditions in which cooperation and contribution arise naturally, as if by the logic of the situation rather than by the design of any individual. Alan understands this as one of the most important practical consequences of mastering your frequency. It does not only change what you receive, it changes what becomes available to you through others. The question of why most men never achieve this frequency, why they remain for their entire lives at the frequency of the seeker rather than the transmitter, is one that Alan answers with characteristic precision and without comfort. The reason is not that the commanding frequency is difficult to reach. It is that reaching it requires a form of inner honesty that most men are constitutionally reluctant to perform. to change your frequency, you must first acknowledge what your frequency is. And acknowledging your actual frequency, your real habitual state, stripped of all its performed confidence and stated beliefs, requires confronting the gap between what you say you are and what you actually are at the level of your daily thinking. This confrontation is uncomfortable. It is not comfortable to discover that the dominant note of your consciousness is not the one you have been claiming. It is not comfortable to recognize that the beliefs you have been publicly endorsing are not the beliefs that are actually governing your signal. But this discomfort is not an obstacle. It is the beginning of the work. The commanding frequency is not a fixed and distant state that only exceptional men can occupy. It is a frequency that becomes more accessible to any man who begins to take deliberate governance of his inner life, who begins to examine with honest precision the habitual quality of his thought, and to replace, one instance at a time, the frequencies of doubt and lack and unworthiness with the frequencies of order, certainty, and genuine worth. This replacement is not a mental trick. It cannot be accomplished through affirmation alone or through the performance of confidence. It must be earned through the kind of sustained inner discipline that Alan describes throughout his work. The daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed practice of maintaining sovereignty over one's own mind, governing one's reactions, holding one's state steady under pressure, refusing to be pulled down from the frequency of command by the temporary evidence of conditions that have not yet caught up with the signal. There is a mechanical logic to this that Alan considers inescapable. The universe cannot return a different condition while the signal remains unchanged. It has no capacity to do so. The law of correspondence does not have an exception clause. It does not say, conditions usually correspond to the dominant signal, but occasionally circumstances intervene. It says that conditions always correspond, without exception, to the dominant quality of the inner life. That the correspondence is total, exact, and perpetual. If conditions are to change, the signal must change first, not simultaneously, first. The inner change precedes the outer one, and it always precedes it by an interval, because the formless must crystallize into form, and crystallization takes time. But the interval is not the refutation of the law. It is simply the time required for the transmission to produce its material effect. What this means for the man who is serious about command, who has decided not merely to understand this law intellectually, but to operate from it as the governing principle of his existence, is that there will be a period of apparent contradiction. A period in which the signal has genuinely changed, but the conditions have not yet reflected that change. A period in which the new frequency is transmitting into what appears to be an indifferent or even hostile external world. This period is the test that separates the man who has genuinely changed his signal from the man who is merely performing the change. Because the man who is performing will observe the unchanged conditions and conclude that the law is not working. And that conclusion, carried back into his signal as doubt, will corrupt the transmission and return conditions to their prior state. The man who has genuinely changed his signal will hold the frequency steady, regardless of what the visible world presents, not through optimism, not through denial, but through the settled certainty of a man who knows that the law is operative, even when its effects are not yet visible. Alan describes this holding of frequency under adverse conditions as one of the highest expressions of inner mastery available to a man, not courage in the conventional sense. Not the courage to act in the face of fear, though that has its own value. The mastery of maintaining your signal while your conditions still contradict it. Of transmitting at the frequency of abundance while the visible world still presents the evidence of its absence, of refusing to allow the current condition to become the defining fact of your consciousness, of knowing that the current condition is the record of a previous signal, not the verdict of an unchangeable law. This distinction between the condition as historical record and the condition as eternal verdict is the one that separates the man who commands from the man who is commanded. The one who knows that the signal governs the condition will not allow the condition to govern the signal. He is the cause. The condition is the effect. This order of priority does not change because the visible world has not yet confirmed it. It is worth pausing on what the commanding frequency demands of a man at the level of character, because this is where Allen's teaching most clearly parts ways with any version of these ideas that might be offered in a more convenient form. The frequency of command is not available to a man who has not done the inner work that makes it genuine. It is not available as a performance, as a pose, as a technique applied to the surface of an unchanged interior. The universe reads the signal at its source, at the level of the habitual, unperformed, private quality of consciousness, and responds to what it finds there, not to the overlay of conscious intention that the man is presenting to himself and others. A man who transmits the frequency of unworthiness at his core and attempts to overlay it with the performance of confidence is transmitting the frequency of unworthiness with a thin veneer of performance on top. The universe sees through the veneer because the universe does not read the surface. It reads the source. The commanding frequency, therefore, is not a destination that can be reached by shortcut. It is the natural emission of a man whose inner life has been brought into genuine alignment with the principles of growth, worth, and law. It is the signal that arises naturally from a consciousness that has been disciplined through sustained inner work into a state of real and unperformed certainty. It is what remains when the seeking reflex has been genuinely dissolved. Not suppressed, not overridden, but dissolved at its root through the clear understanding that seeking and receiving are incompatible frequencies, and that the only work worth doing is the work of becoming the transmission that calls the desired conditions home. And when a man reaches this frequency, not as a peak state, not as an occasional experience, but as his habitual, dominant, resting condition, the evidence appears. Not all at once, and not always in the form he expected. But it appears. It appears because it cannot fail to appear. The law does not break for any man, under any circumstance, at any point in the history of the universe. When the signal is clean, when the frequency is right, when the inner life is genuinely ordered and genuinely aligned with the principle of abundance, rather than the principle of lack, the response is not a possibility. It is a certainty. It is the only thing the universe knows how to do with a clear signal. It answers it, not as a favor, not as a reward, but as the automatic, lawful, inevitable consequence of a transmission that has finally become what it was always meant to be. Wallace Wattles teaches in his foundational work that the formless substance of which all things are made responds to the mental image held with faith and gratitude. That the act of impressing a clear and unwavering vision upon the intelligent substance is the mechanism by which that vision is drawn into physical form. This is a precise and powerful instruction, but it contains within it a question that Wattles himself gestures toward without fully resolving. What determines the strength of that impression? What is the force that drives the mental image deep enough into the formless substance that it cannot be dissolved by the friction of daily circumstance? That it holds its integrity under pressure, maintains its form against doubt, and crystallizes into the physical world with the fidelity that the method demands. Wattles names faith and gratitude as the necessary conditions. But he does not fully articulate what generates those conditions at their source. James Allen answers this question with the precision that Wattles leaves open. The strength of the impression is determined by the purity and consistency of the signal behind it. This is not a minor supplemental point. It is the upstream condition of the entire creative process, as Wattles describes it. Consider what it means with full logical force. A man whose dominant frequency is one of fear and lack cannot hold a clean mental image of abundance, regardless of how earnestly he applies himself to the practice. The signal is corrupted at the source. At the level of his habitual emotional tone, his bedrock assumptions about his own worth and the nature of what is available to him, the mental image he attempts to hold is continuously being undermined by the frequency from which it is being held. It is as though he is attempting to project a clear picture from a projector whose internal mechanism is generating a different image simultaneously. The two images do not combine into a third. They interfere with each other. The result is not abundance. The result is the static of a man at war with his own transmission. Allen's frequency secret, understood in this light, is not a competing system to Wattles' method. It is the prerequisite of that method. It is the work that must be done before the work of creative visualization becomes fully operative. The inner clarification without which the outer process remains perpetually approximate, perpetually interrupted by the very doubts it was designed to resolve. Clean the signal first. This is Allen's instruction. And it is the instruction that most students of these laws overlook because they are drawn to the visible and active practice. The holding of the vision, the expression of gratitude, the deliberate claiming of the desired good, without first attending to the invisible infrastructure from which those practices must draw their power. The infrastructure is the signal. The signal is the character, and the character is built, as Allen teaches without apology, from the slow, disciplined, sustained governance of habitual thought. When a man has done this work, when the frequency of his habitual consciousness has been genuinely elevated to the register of certainty, worth, and alignment with the principle of expansion, the method Wattles describes does not merely function. It becomes, in Allen's term, irresistible. The mental image is held from a position of genuine inner stability. It does not need to be protected from doubt because doubt is no longer the dominant frequency. It does not need to be reinforced every morning because the state from which it is held is not a temporary peak, but a settled baseline. The impression it makes upon the formless substance is correspondingly deep, correspondingly clean, correspondingly sustained. And a deep, clean, sustained impression upon the formless substance does not produce a possible outcome. It produces a certain one. Allen and Wattles, read together and understood in their correct relationship, are not two competing philosophies. They are a single complete system. Wattles mapping the mechanism of creative impression, Allen identifying the inner condition without which that mechanism cannot operate at its full and lawful power. What makes this synthesis so demanding and so important is that it forecloses the comfortable interpretation of Wattles' method that many students adopt. The comfortable interpretation is that the method is a technique to be applied from whatever inner state you happen to currently occupy, that you simply begin practicing, regardless of your signal, and the practice itself will produce the change. Allen's teaching does not permit this reading. The signal precedes the practice. The character precedes the creative act. The quality of the emission determines the quality of the impression. This is not a discouragement of practice. It is the instruction to practice at the correct level, which is the level of the inner life, rather than the level of the conscious visualization exercise. The conscious visualization exercise is the visible expression of an inner state. If the inner state is not the state of abundance, the exercise is not the expression of abundance. It is the performance of it, and the universe, as Alan is unsparing in reminding us, responds to the state, not the performance. It reads the signal. It does not watch the show. Wattles warns, with a persistence that amounts to urgency, against allowing doubt to color the creative process. He returns to this warning repeatedly throughout his work, because he understands that doubt is not merely a psychological discomfort. It is a functional interference in the mechanism of creation. When doubt is present, the creative process is not merely slowed or weakened. It is structurally compromised. The impression cannot hold its integrity. The substance cannot crystallize around a form that is continuously being dissolved by the doubt of the man who created it. Wattles identifies this as the single most common cause of failure in the application of his method. But he identifies it at the level of the conscious mental act, without fully explaining what doubt looks like at the deeper level where Allen locates the problem. James Allen explains what doubt looks like at the frequency level, and what he describes is both precise and unsparing. It is a split signal. It is two contradictory transmissions operating simultaneously from the same source. The split signal is the most common condition of the aspiring man, and it is the most thoroughly invisible to him. From the outside, and often from inside his own conscious mind, he appears to be a man of genuine aspiration and reasonable confidence. He has studied the laws. He has adopted the language of abundance. He consciously affirms his desired good and endeavors to hold his vision with faith. But underneath this conscious orientation, in the habitual unperformed register of his actual emotional life, he broadcasts a different frequency entirely. He broadcasts the signal of a man who has been disappointed before and expects to be again. The signal of a man who wants abundance but does not genuinely believe, in the marrow of his experience, that he is the kind of being from whom abundance would naturally flow. The signal of a man who is, at his core, still in the posture of the seeker, still reaching for something external, still depending on the conditions to confirm what he cannot confirm from within. The universe receives this as static. Not silence, not a clear message of lack, static. The two frequencies do not cancel each other out into neutrality. They interfere with each other in a way that produces an output more chaotic than either frequency alone would have generated. This is why the man with the split signal so often experiences a particularly frustrating pattern. Brief improvements, followed by sharp contractions. Near misses that seem to confirm the law is at work, while the full manifestation never arrives. Periods of genuine momentum abruptly interrupted by reversals that seem to come from nowhere. This is not bad luck. This is the mechanical signature of a split signal. The improvements correspond to the moments when the conscious frequency of abundance briefly dominates. The contractions correspond to the moments when the underlying frequency of lack reasserts its dominance. The pattern will continue, Allen teaches, until the gap is closed, until the signal is unified at the source, until the dominant frequency of the habitual inner life genuinely matches the frequency that the conscious mind is attempting to transmit. Most people are not failing to command abundance because they lack knowledge of the law, or because they lack the desire to apply it, or because they have not put in the requisite effort. They are failing because their signal is perpetually scrambled by the gap between what they say they believe and what they actually emit from the baseline of their daily inner experience. This is Alan's diagnosis, and it is not a gentle one. It places the responsibility squarely in the interior of the individual. Not in his education, not in his circumstances, not in the efficiency of his method, but in the honesty and depth of his inner work. The gap between stated belief and actual emission is a gap that cannot be closed by acquiring more sophisticated techniques or more comprehensive knowledge of the creative process. It can only be closed by the kind of sustained, unglamorous inner discipline that gradually elevates the habitual frequency from the level of doubt and lack to the level of genuine certainty. Alan's work is, in this precise sense, the science of closing that gap, not in the sense that it provides a procedure to be followed mechanically, but in the sense that it identifies with absolute clarity where the gap is located, what generates it, what sustains it, and what the conditions are under which it can be genuinely and permanently resolved. The gap is located in the difference between the man's conscious beliefs and his habitual state. It is generated by years of accumulated thought patterns, emotional reactions, and unchallenged assumptions that have built a frequency baseline far below the one his conscious aspirations are attempting to reach. It is sustained by the very conditions it produces, by the external evidence of lack that, when observed, confirms the underlying frequency and drives it deeper into the baseline. And it can only be closed, Alan teaches, by the patient, deliberate sovereign governance of habitual thought. By catching every instance of the low frequency as it arises and replacing it, not with performance, but with the genuine understanding that that frequency does not belong to a man who has understood the law and accepted its authority over his inner life. Alan is explicit, not suggestive, not metaphorical, but explicit, on the question of how the signal is purified, and what he identifies as the mechanism of purification is neither technique nor ritual. It is character. The quality of a man's emission is determined, with mechanical fidelity, by the quality of his inner life, by the actual, habitual, unperformed character of his thoughts, his reactions, his private assessments of himself and others, and his foundational assumptions about what the world owes him and what he owes the world. This means that purifying the signal is not, in any sense, a communication strategy. It is not a matter of learning to present yourself differently, speak about yourself differently, or cultivate the outward appearance of a man at a different frequency. It is a character project. It is the slow, precise, demanding work of actually becoming a different kind of being, or being at the level of habitual inner life. And it begins not in the grand moments of deliberate practice, but in the thousand small, unwitnessed instances of ordinary daily experience. Every time a man catches a thought of resentment, a thought that assigns blame to another for the state of his conditions, or that defines his situation as an injustice done to him by the world, and replaces it not by suppression, but by the genuine understanding that resentment is a low-frequency emission that has never returned anything but its own likeness. Something shifts. The signal clarifies, not dramatically, not visibly, not in a way that produces an immediately measurable effect in the external world, but at the level of the transmission, the frequency rises by a precise amount corresponding to the precise quality of the exchange that has just been made. One instance of resentment converted to genuine goodwill, not performed goodwill, not the goodwill that a man adopts as a strategy while the resentment continues to operate beneath it, but the genuine recognition that the other person is themselves a field of thought operating under the same laws, broadcasting their own signal, receiving their own inevitable correspondence. That conversion represents a real and permanent improvement in the quality of the transmission. The same principle governs every habitual reaction. Every time a man meets a setback with composure instead of panic. Not the performance of composure, not the suppression of a panic that continues to simmer beneath a controlled exterior, but the genuine equanimity of a man who understands that the setback is a condition, not a verdict, and that conditions are the product of previous signals rather than the evidence of an unalterable fate. The signal strengthens. The strengthening is not incidental to the equanimity. It is the equanimity. The calm is the frequency. The composure is not a response to the signal. It is the signal. This is why Allen insists that the outer conditions of a man's life are so faithfully reflective of his inner state. Because the inner state is not something separate from the transmission. It is the transmission. The quality of the reaction is the quality of the broadcast. The practice of signal purification extends also to the domain of language, specifically to the language of lack that most men speak habitually and unconsciously. To speak of your insufficiency, to narrate your conditions in the register of permanent limitation, to adopt the vocabulary of a man who does not expect the law to work on his behalf. And all of this is not merely the expression of a frequency. It is the reinforcement of one. Language is not a transparent medium through which inner states are communicated. It is a generative act. The words a man speaks about himself and his conditions do not merely describe his frequency. They participate in maintaining and deepening it. Every time a man refuses to speak the language of lack, not because he is denying the current state of his conditions, but because he understands that giving voice to that state as permanent and defining is the act of broadcasting it more powerfully. The frequency rises, not slightly, significantly, because the discipline of language is the discipline of thought made audible, and the discipline of thought is the direct practice of signal governance. What Allen is describing, taken in its full scope, is the recognition that every element of a man's inner and outer behavior participates in the construction of his signal. The transmitter is not a fixed piece of equipment that can be upgraded through a single concentrated act of will. It is built continuously, incrementally, inevitably. From the aggregate quality of every thought held, every reaction chosen, every assumption examined or left unexamined, every word spoken in the direction of abundance or in the direction of lack. The signal is the sum of these choices, and each choice either clarifies the signal or corrupts it. There is no neutral act. Every moment of genuine inner governance is a moment of signal improvement. Every moment of unconscious habitual reaction is a moment in which the existing frequency is reinforced and deepened. The transmitter is being built right now from the quality of the inner life you are choosing or failing to choose to inhabit. The implication of this is both demanding and for the man who is genuinely ready to receive it. Clarifying. It means that the work of building a powerful signal is not the work of great occasional efforts. It is the work of small, consistent daily choices made in the interior of the mind, far from any audience, producing no immediate visible reward, demanding sustained attention and honest self-examination without the encouragement of confirming results. Allen describes this as the most important labor a man can undertake, more consequential than any external activity, more determinative of the ultimate shape of his life than any strategy, opportunity, or circumstance, because all those things are downstream of the signal. And the signal is built one deliberate thought at a time. From the quality of the inner life that a man chooses to govern or to abandon to the default frequencies of unconscious habit. This purification does not require perfection. Alan does not demand a standard of absolute and uninterrupted inner clarity as the prerequisite for receiving anything from the law. What he demands, and the word is appropriate, because Alan speaks of inner law with the authority of one describing non-negotiable conditions rather than aspirational ideals, is direction, progress. The consistent, honest movement of the habitual frequency upward toward the register of clarity, worth, and genuine alignment with the principle of abundance. A man who fails once, who catches himself in a thought of resentment too late, who reacts to a setback with momentary panic, who speaks in the register of lack before he hears himself doing it, has not broken anything. He has simply observed where his signal still has work to do. What he does with that observation is the test. The man who uses it to reinforce the story of his own inadequacy is transmitting inadequacy. The man who uses it as precise information about the state of his signal, information to be acted upon with the same calm, impersonal precision with which a technician adjusts a transmitter, is already transmitting at a frequency significantly higher than the one that produced the lapse. The transmitter is built from the inside, one deliberate thought at a time. This is not a reduction of the complexity of Alan's system. It is the distillation of it, everything else in his teaching. Every observation about the nature of thought, every analysis of how conditions correspond to inner states, every map of how the formless substance responds to the quality of mental emission, all of it converges on this single operational instruction. Go inside, take governance, choose the thought, not once, not heroically, not in a single transformative act of will, but repeatedly, daily, patiently, across the entire expanse of your ordinary inner life. In the moments that seem too small to matter, in the hours when no one is watching and nothing appears to be at stake, in the quiet that most men fill with habitual noise, that is where the signal is built. That is where the transmitter earns the frequency it will eventually broadcast to the world. And the world, faithful to its laws, will receive that broadcast and return what corresponds to it. Always, without exception, exactly as transmitted. The most common source of signal corruption, Alan identifies it with a precision that leaves no room for misinterpretation, is what he calls impure motive. Not ignorance, not lack of effort, not insufficient application of technique. Impure motive. The desire for abundance rooted not in the genuine expression of a growing, expanding, purposeful life, but in the fear of its opposite, in the anxiety, conscious or unconscious, of a man who is not pursuing what he wants, but fleeing what he dreads. This is a distinction so subtle that most men never perceive it in themselves, yet so structurally consequential that it determines the entire character of their transmission and, therefore, the entire character of what the universe returns to them. Two men can pursue identical external goals, the same profession, the same level of financial attainment, the same vision of a prosperous and ordered life, and emit entirely different signals based on nothing more than the difference in what is driving them from beneath the level of their conscious intentions. The man driven by fear of poverty is not pursuing abundance. He is fleeing lack. His is not the signal of expansion. It is the signal of contraction. The goal may be stated in the language of wealth, but the frequency at which that goal is being pursued is the frequency of poverty, because poverty is the dominant reality of his inner life. It is the thing he thinks about most. It is the thing that shapes his decisions, colors his perceptions, and determines his emotional baseline. The object of his fear is more present in his consciousness than the vision of the life he claims to be working toward. And the universe, reading the signal with its customary impersonal precision, responds not to the stated goal, but to the dominant frequency of the consciousness pursuing it. The dominant frequency is fear of lack. The response is the sustained experience of a man in proximity to lack, always working against it, never quite free of it, perpetually running from the thing that is, because it is the governing reality of his inner life, always catching him. This is one of the most difficult recognitions that Alan's teaching demands, because it implicates not just the quality of a man's thinking, but the quality of his relationship to his own desire. It asks a man to examine not merely what he wants, but why he wants it. Not in the sense of a therapeutic exercise, but in the precise diagnostic sense of understanding what frequency his wanting is operating at. The question is not a philosophical one. It has practical consequences of the most direct and measurable kind. The man who desires abundance from fear is transmitting at the frequency of fear. The man who desires abundance from the genuine, expansive desire to express his highest capacity, to build something worthy of his nature, to contribute at the level of his fullest potential, to inhabit the life that corresponds to the most developed version of himself, is transmitting at an entirely different frequency. Call it the frequency of expansion, of growth, of genuine creative force, uncontaminated by the anxiety of what might happen if it fails. This is the frequency that Alan identifies as the one to which the formless substance responds with generosity, with speed, with the kind of abundant and seemingly effortless return that observers from outside attribute to luck, and insiders know to be the mechanical consequence of a clean and powerful signal. The subtlety of this distinction is what makes it so easy to miss and so devastating when it is missed. Because the two men, the one driven by fear and the one driven by genuine expansive purpose, may, from the outside, look identical. They may put in the same hours, speak the same language of aspiration, read the same books, apply the same methods. The difference between them is invisible to any external observer, and crucially, invisible to many internal ones as well. A man can be driven by fear of poverty for his entire working life, and sincerely believe, at the conscious level of his stated intentions, that what drives him is the love of abundance, the desire for freedom, the aspiration towards something greater. The fear operates below the threshold of comfortable self-awareness. It manifests not as the dramatic anxiety of a man who is visibly afraid, but as the constant, low-grade urgency of a man who is never quite at rest, never quite satisfied, never quite capable of the kind of settled certainty that the commanding frequency requires. It manifests as the signal that is always slightly tense, always slightly contracted, always just a degree away from what it would be if the man were genuinely operating from the frequency of expansion rather than the frequency of escape. Alan's prescription for this condition is not a psychological technique. It is, again, a character project. The purification of motive requires a man to examine, with genuine and sustained honesty, what is actually driving him. Not once, as a preliminary act of self-knowledge, but repeatedly, as an ongoing practice of inner governance. It requires him to catch the moments when fear is the operative force behind an ostensibly ambitious action, to acknowledge that fact without self-judgment and without the defensive reflex to reframe it as something more flattering, and to make the deliberate shift from the frequency of escape to the frequency of genuine purpose. This shift is not a decision that can be made once and maintained without effort. It is a direction that must be chosen again and again in the ordinary moments of daily work until the frequency of genuine expansion becomes the habitual baseline from which all action arises, until the signal is no longer contaminated at its source by the anxiety it was meant to transcend. The deepest implication of Allen's teaching on impure motive is this: the signal does not lie. This is not an encouragement. It is a warning. The universe receives the signal beneath the performance, the actual frequency of the actual habitual inner life, and responds to that with the same faithful, impersonal, mechanical precision with which it responds to everything else. A man cannot fake his signal. He cannot broadcast the frequency of fear while performing the language of abundance and expect the universe to be fooled by the performance. The universe does not watch the performance. It reads the signal. And if the signal says fear, the experience will say fear. Regardless of how many books the man has read, how many affirmations he has spoken, how many vision boards he has constructed, how earnestly and how visibly he has applied himself to the work of attracting a different condition. The action is not the cause. The signal is the cause. The action is downstream, and the signal flows from motive. So the man who has not examined and genuinely purified his motive has not reached the source of the problem, regardless of every other effort he has made. He has, with great diligence and genuine effort, been treating the symptom. The signal, unchanged, unexamined, still broadcasting the frequency of a man at war with the possibility of lack, continues to call that lack toward him with the same lawful, impersonal certainty it always has. And it will continue to do so until the motive is genuinely purified at its root. Allen identifies a paradox that confounds the mind of every man, whose concept of power has been formed entirely by the demands and assumptions of a culture addicted to visible, frantic, unceasing action. The paradox is this: the strongest signal is not emitted from a state of maximum exertion or maximum intensity. It is emitted from a state of profound inner stillness, not inactivity. Allen is not teaching passivity, and this distinction is critical to a correct understanding of his system. The man who is inactive is not still. He is merely stopped. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the quality of consciousness from which motion, when it occurs, arises with full force and complete integrity, undivided by the noise of anxiety and the static of unresolved inner conflict. The man in constant mental agitation, in the perpetual hum of worry, anticipation, resentment, and reactive thought, is not transmitting powerfully. He is transmitting widely and weakly, his signals scattered across dozens of competing frequencies simultaneously, its force dissipated by the very busyness of the consciousness generating it. Consider what mental agitation does to the signal at the level of mechanics. Every anxious thought is a frequency. Every unresolved fear operating in the background of the mind is a frequency. Every distraction, every reactive judgment, every internal argument the man is conducting with himself or others is a frequency. And when a man's inner life is populated by all of these simultaneously, when the consciousness is in a state of constant low-grade turbulence, as it is for most men in most hours of most days, the transmission is not one clean signal. It is a field of noise, and the universe, receiving this field of noise, cannot return a clean or coherent condition because there is no clean or coherent signal to respond to. The conditions that arrive are correspondingly chaotic, fragmented, and inconsistent, sometimes promising, sometimes disappointing, never quite settling into the stable pattern of genuine abundance. Because the signal generating them is itself in a state of perpetual, low-grade fragmentation, the man who has cultivated genuine inner stillness, who has done the inner work required to quiet the noise, to resolve the unexamined conflicts, to bring the habitual reactions under the governance of deliberate consciousness, transmits with a clarity and concentration of force that the agitated man cannot approach regardless of how intensely he applies himself. This is because stillness is not the absence of force. It is the condition under which force becomes concentrated, coherent, and irresistible. Think of the difference between light scattered in all directions from 100 small sources and the same quantity of light concentrated into a single coherent beam. The total energy is identical, but the beam cuts through where the scattered light merely illuminates. The beam has penetrating force where the scattered light has only ambient presence. The consciousness of the still man is the beam. The consciousness of the agitated man is the scatter. Same energy, entirely different effect on the substance that receives it. This understanding reframes entirely what Alan means by the instruction to cultivate inner stillness. He is not speaking of a meditative ideal or a spiritual aspiration toward tranquility. He is describing a practical upgrade in the technical quality of the transmission. When you quiet the inner noise, you are not becoming more peaceful in the sentimental sense. You are becoming more powerful in the most precise and mechanically accurate sense. You are concentrating the force of your consciousness into a single coherent frequency. You are reducing the interference within your own signal. You are, in the language of the transmission metaphor, increasing the signal-to-noise ratio of your broadcast to the point where the universe receives something definite, something clear, something it can respond to with corresponding definiteness and clarity. The stillness is not the goal. It is the condition of effective emission. It is the technical prerequisite for a signal strong enough to command rather than merely request. The action-obsessed man, the man whose entire philosophy of power is built on the premise that more effort, more speed, more relentless application of will is always the answer, will find this teaching not merely counterintuitive, but offensive. It challenges the foundational assumption of the culture he has been formed by. But Alan does not present it as a preference or a style. He presents it as a structural fact about how the field of thought operates. A scattered signal is weak regardless of the intensity of the mind that generates it. A concentrated signal is powerful regardless of the quietness of the mind that generates it. Intensity and concentration are not the same thing. Effort and force are not the same thing. The agitated man has intensity. The still man has force. And in the domain of signal emission, force is what the universe responds to. Intensity produces more noise. Force produces coherent signal, and coherent signal produces coherent conditions. There is a common objection to this teaching that arises in every mind that has not yet resolved the contradiction Alan is pointing to. If stillness is the condition of powerful emission, and action is required to bring conditions into physical form, then how are the two reconciled? Does the teaching of inner stillness counsel withdrawal from the world of action? Alan's answer is precise and unambiguous. Stillness is the quality of the inner state from which action arises, not the replacement of action. The still man acts. He acts with complete engagement, with full presence, with every faculty brought to bear on the task at hand. What is absent is not the action. What is absent is the turbulence, the anxiety beneath the action, the fear behind the effort, the inner noise that accompanies most men's activity, like a shadow they cannot separate from themselves. The action without the turbulence is a qualitatively different act. It carries the full force of the concentrated signal rather than the scattered energy of the agitated one. It accomplishes more with less effort, encounters less resistance, and leaves the man who performed it more ordered than when he began, rather than depleted by the friction of his own inner conflict. Think of the craftsman who works from a state of complete absorption, fully present to the material, completely concentrated, inner life utterly quiet, versus the craftsman who works from a state of anxiety about the outcome, distraction, and unresolved pressures from outside the work. Both men are active. Both men are applying themselves to the same task. But the quality of their attention is entirely different. And the quality of their work is entirely different. And the signal they are broadcasting into the formless substance while they work is entirely different. The first man is transmitting the signal of mastery, concentrated, clear, aligned with the principle of competent and purposeful action. The second is transmitting the signal of a man in conflict with himself. What returns to each man, over time, as the accumulated experience of his life, will correspond to those signals with the same precision that Allen attributes to all correspondence between inner state and outer condition. The cultivation of inner stillness is therefore not a practice separate from the work of building a powerful signal. It is that work, viewed from its most fundamental angle. Every external practice, the discipline of thought, the purification of motive, the governance of reaction, is, at its deepest level, a practice of cultivating the kind of inner stillness that allows the signal to become concentrated, coherent, and genuinely powerful. The goal is not the performance of calm, it is the reality of it. The unforced, unperformed, habitual quiet of a mind that has brought its own inner life under sufficient governance, that it no longer generates the noise that scatters the signal and weakens the transmission. When this quiet is genuine, the force it concentrates is formidable. And when the force is concentrated, the signal it produces is the kind of signal that the universe does not merely receive, but responds to with the immediate, orderly, lawful abundance that has always been the natural return on a clear transmission sent into the infinite and responsive substance of things. The paradox resolves itself once the principle is understood in its full depth. Stillness is not the surrender of power. It is its optimal condition. The river that is still at its surface and deep in its current moves more water with less turbulence and more force than the river that is agitated at every point. The deep current is the signal. The surface agitation is the noise. Most men live entirely at the surface, generating enormous agitation, expending enormous energy, and moving very little of what they wish to move in the world. The man who has gone deep, who has cultivated the genuine, unhurried, unperformed stillness that Allen describes, moves the world with a quietness that confounds the surface dwellers, not because he has superior knowledge of strategy or superior access to resources, because his signal is concentrated, his transmission is clean, and the universe, obeying its own laws, is responding to what he actually is, rather than to the noise that most men mistake for the thing itself. The path to this stillness is not secret. Allen describes it throughout his work with the same precision he brings to every element of his teaching. It is the path of inner governance, of daily, sustained, unglamorous dominion over the quality of habitual thought. Every time you govern a reaction rather than be governed by it, the signal deepens. Every time you refuse to allow external noise to become internal noise, the concentration increases. every time you choose the frequency of certainty over the frequency of anxiety in one ordinary, unwitnessed moment of daily life. The stillness at the center of your transmission grows by exactly the amount of that choice. Not dramatically, not visibly, but actually. And the accumulated effect of these choices, made consistently over time without the distraction of needing to see immediate results, is the gradual construction of the inner quiet that Alan identifies as the most powerful state available to a human being. The state from which a man does not merely emit a signal, but commands a response, because his transmission has finally become what the universe, faithful to its own laws, cannot fail to answer. Alan describes, with the quiet certainty of one who has observed this event in his own inner experience and recognized its significance, a recognizable internal state that marks the transition from the condition of the seeker to the condition of the transmitter. It is not a dramatic event. It does not arrive with the force of revelation or the heat of emotional climax. It arrives characteristically in the quiet, in an ordinary moment, often after a sustained period of genuine inner work, often without any corresponding change in external conditions that might explain or justify it. What happens is this: the searching stops. Not as a decision made by a man who has resolved to stop searching, not as an effort of will, not as a technique applied to the management of inner states. It stops as the natural consequence of a deeper shift. The shift that occurs when a man has genuinely ceased to experience the gap between what he is and what his desired conditions require of him. When the gap closes inwardly, the searching that was a response to the gap ceases to be a relevant activity. The man is no longer in the posture of one who lacks what he seeks. He is in the posture of one who is already, inwardly, what the desired conditions would express. A quiet, unforced confidence settles in. Alan is precise about the quality of this confidence, and his precision matters. It is not arrogance. Arrogance is a performance of superiority that is sustained by the need to compensate for a private doubt. The man whose confidence is the product of genuine inner work has no private doubt to compensate for. He is not performing superiority. He simply does not experience the inferiority that most men's confidence is designed to conceal. The state he inhabits is closer to certainty than to confidence. And the difference between the two is the difference between a position a man holds and a ground a man stands on. Confidence must be maintained. Certainty simply is. It does not require renewal every morning. It does not require external confirmation. It does not weaken under the pressure of contrary evidence in the visible world. It is the settled knowing of a man who has understood, not merely intellectually, but in the texture of his daily inner experience, that the law is operative and that he is in right relationship with it. The man in this state does not feel that abundance is coming. This is an important and precise distinction that Alan draws with considerable care. The feeling of abundance is coming still contains within it the implication of a gap, a distance yet to be traveled, a condition yet to be reached, a space between present reality and desired reality. The man at the frequency of genuine command does not experience that gap. He feels, not believes, feels in the immediate, unargued, baseline register of his daily consciousness that his desired conditions are already in correspondence with who he is, that they exist, fully formed, in the invisible substance from which all physical conditions crystallize, that their arrival in the visible world is not a matter of whether, but merely a matter of when. And the when is simply the time required for the invisible to become visible, for the crystallized signal to take physical form. This is not the wishful thinking of a man who has adopted optimism as a coping mechanism. It is the resting state of a man whose signal has become genuinely aligned with the frequency of the conditions he has called into being. When this state is genuine and not performed, and Alan's insistence on the word genuine here is not incidental, the signal has locked. This is the precise language of the transmission metaphor applied to the inner event, and it captures something that softer language cannot. The signal locking is not a metaphor for feeling good about yourself. It is a description of the moment when the dominant frequency of the habitual inner life has ceased to oscillate between the competing signals of abundance and lack, certainty and doubt, worth and unworthiness, when it has stabilized definitively at the frequency of command. The oscillation, which was the source of the static, has resolved. The transmission is clean. The broadcast is coherent, and a coherent broadcast, sent into the infinite and responsive substance of things, produces a coherent response. Not eventually, not probably, not under favorable conditions, but necessarily, inevitably, as the logical consequence of a law that does not have exceptions. From this point, the point at which the signal has genuinely locked and the inner life is no longer in oscillation, Alan says something that is worth allowing to arrive with its full weight before proceeding. He says that from this point, the man does not attract his good. He commands it. The distinction is not merely semantic. To attract implies a kind of pull, a drawing toward oneself of something external, something that could, in principle, be drawn towards someone else. To command is to occupy the position of cause rather than effect, to be the source from which the condition flows rather than the recipient toward whom it moves. The man who commands does not need the universe to be generous with him. He does not depend on the goodwill of circumstances or the cooperation of fortune. He is, at the level of his dominant signal, the precise and sufficient cause of the conditions that arrive. He is the transmitter that has finally become what it was built to be, and the universe, faithful to the law that governs it, does what it has always done and will always do with a clean, powerful, coherent signal. It answers. There is a law that has been operating in your life from the beginning. Before you were aware of it, before you had language for it, before you had any understanding of its architecture or its demands. It is the law of correspondence between the dominant quality of the inner life and the character of the outer conditions. This law has never taken a moment off. It has never made an exception for ignorance, for effort, for good intention, or for the sincerity of desire. It has been executing its function with perfect, impersonal fidelity every moment of every day of your existence, returning to you, without remainder and without distortion, the exact equivalent of what you have been transmitting from the depths of your habitual consciousness. Not a punishment, not a reward, a reflection, the most faithful reflection available in the visible world. What this means, taken to its full and unambiguous conclusion, is that abundance has never been hiding from you. It has not been withheld by an indifferent universe, sequestered by the fortunate, or placed beyond your reach by the injustice of circumstance. It has been responding to you with the same faithfulness, the same precision, the same absolute mechanical reliability with which it has always responded to every human being who has ever generated a signal coherent enough to command a response. The conditions you have experienced are not a record of what the world has done to you. They are a record of what you have transmitted. They are the signal made solid, the frequency made form, the invisible made visible through the patient and impersonal operation of law. This is not a comfortable recognition. Alan never presents it as one. He presents it as the kind of truth that, once genuinely understood, forecloses all comfortable alternatives. Once you know that the signal determines the condition, not as a probability, not as a tendency, but as an inviolable law, you cannot reasonably return to the posture of the seeker. You cannot continue to treat your conditions as something happening to you from outside, as something to be improved by changes in strategy or circumstance, while the signal from which they arise remains unchanged. The only work that matters, the only work that has ever mattered at the level of final cause, is the work of becoming the transmission that commands the life you have the capacity and the nature to inhabit. Not the life you wish for from a distance, not the life you admire in others, the life that corresponds to what you genuinely are at your fullest development, the life that is the natural expression of your highest capacity, your most developed character, your most ordered and purposeful inner state. This is the life that your signal, when it is clean and powerful and free from the corruption of fear and lack and impure motive, calls into existence as inevitably as a tower calls music from the air. You were not given a life to find. You were given a signal to emit, and the nature of what you emit determines, with the fidelity of law, the nature of what arrives. The transmitter that finally understands this does not search. It transmits. And in transmitting, clearly, powerfully, from the deep stillness of a governed and ordered inner life, it commands everything that was always already in correspondence with it. James Allen writes, in words that carry the compression of a man who has spent decades distilling a truth to its irreducible essence. A man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts. This is not a poetic claim about the influence of attitude on experience. It is an ontological statement about the nature of what a man is. He is literally, not metaphorically, not approximately, but literally, the sum total of his habitual thinking, not the sum of his actions, not the sum of his achievements, not the sum of what has been done to him or for him or around him. The sum of his thoughts, the aggregate of his habitual inner life, compounded over time into the character that constitutes his actual being, which then, by the operation of law, determines the character of everything that comes to him. Character is signal. Signal determines condition. This is the complete chain. Allen continues, every condition of his life is drawn to him by the invisible but infallible law of correspondence. Infallible. This word is the one that must be fully received before the teaching can do its work on the inner life. Not usually reliable, not highly accurate. Infallible, without the possibility of failure, without exception or variance or condition under which it does not apply. The law of correspondence is as infallible as gravity. Not because it was proclaimed to be so by any authority, but because the nature of the universe is such that inner conditions and outer conditions are not merely correlated. They are the same event viewed from different angles. The outer condition is the inner condition externalized. It is the signal taken from the invisible medium of thought and crystallized into the visible medium of circumstance. To change the circumstance without changing the signal is to attempt to alter the visible portion of a single event while leaving the invisible portion unchanged. The event reconstitutes itself. The condition returns. What Allen is giving you in this statement is not a philosophy to be admired. It is a law to be obeyed. not obeyed in the sense of submission to an external authority, but obeyed in the sense that a craftsman obeys the nature of his material, with full understanding, genuine respect, and the practical intelligence of a man who works with the law rather than against it. The man who works with the law of correspondence does not attempt to change his conditions by acting on them while his signal remains unchanged. He changes his signal. He alters the quality of his habitual thought, the character of his dominant inner life, and allows the conditions faithful to the law to follow. This is not passivity. It is the most active and demanding form of self-governance available to a human being. It is the governance of the cause rather than the management of the effect, and it is the only governance that produces a lasting and genuine change in the conditions of a man's life. The full weight of Alan's statement is this: you have never been the victim of your conditions. Your conditions have always been the faithful servant of your character, executing the law of correspondence with the same impersonal reliability that governs every other law of nature. The conditions that have frustrated you, limited you, and driven you to seek something better were not arbitrary. They were precise. They were the exact and accurate return on the signal you were transmitting at the time they formed. This is not an accusation. It is a liberation. Because if the condition is the product of the signal, and the signal is yours, entirely, exclusively, irrevocably yours, then the signal can be changed. And if the signal can be changed, the condition can be changed. Not through hope, not through external intervention, not through the favorable alignment of circumstances you cannot control. Through the disciplined, sovereign, deliberate governance of the one thing in the universe that is absolutely and unconditionally under your authority, the quality of your habitual thought. Alan's teaching on thought as the origin of all conditions is not a consolation. It is a challenge of the most fundamental and demanding kind. It challenges you to accept, without qualification and without the protective buffer of external blame, that the conditions of your life are an accurate portrait of your signal. It challenges you to look at that portrait with the clarity of a man who wants to know the truth more than he wants to be comforted. And then it challenges you to do the inner work, patient, unglamorous, unwitnessed, demanding, and entirely consequential, of changing the signal until the portrait changes with it. Not as an experiment, not as a strategy that you will maintain for as long as it seems to be working, as the governing principle of your inner life. Accept it as fully and as permanently as you accept the reality of any other law that governs the physical world you inhabit. The Master's truth is not gentle, but it is complete. It asks nothing from the universe that the universe has not already made available. It asks nothing from you that you do not already have the capacity to give. What it asks is this: govern your mind. Build your character from the materials of ordered, purposeful, genuinely purposive thought. Emit the signal that corresponds to the life you have the nature and the capacity to inhabit, and then allow the law, infallible, impersonal, and absolutely faithful, to do what it has always done and will always do. Return to you in the form of your conditions, the exact character of what you are. When what you are is finally aligned with what you are capable of, the signal and the life become one thing. And that convergence, that moment of absolute correspondence between the inner transmission and the outer expression, is what Alan means when he speaks of a man realizing the full force and dominion of his own nature. Not as aspiration, as fact. Stop searching. This is not a suggestion offered in the register of encouragement. It is a diagnosis and a correction The searching is the problem. The searching was always the problem. Every hour you have spent in the posture of a man who does not yet have what he needs, moving through the world with the orientation of one reaching for something beyond his current possession. Every one of those hours has been a transmission. A precise, powerful, and utterly faithful broadcast of the signal of a man who does not have, sent into the infinite responsive substance of things, which has returned to you, without fail and without exception, the experience of a man who does not have. The universe has not been ignoring you. It has been obeying you. It has been doing what it always does, responding to your signal with the fidelity of law. Start transmitting. Understand what this means before you carry it out of this moment. It does not mean performing confidence. It does not mean speaking the language of abundance, while the signal beneath your words broadcasts the frequency of lack. It does not mean adopting a new set of positive statements to overlay an unchanged interior. It means doing the inner work, the actual, demanding, patient, unglamorous work of elevating the dominant quality of your habitual consciousness to the register of genuine certainty, genuine worth, and genuine alignment with the principle of expansion. It means going to the transmitter, to the baseline quality of your daily inner life, and changing what is being broadcast from the source. One deliberate thought at a time, one governed reaction at a time, one honest examination of motive at a time. Day after day, in private, without witnesses, without the encouragement of conditions that have not yet caught up with the new signal. The universe has never ignored you. Let this arrive with its full force, because it is the reversal of the story that most men tell about their conditions and their lives. The universe has not been indifferent to your desires, or unmoved by your effort, or blind to your worth. It has been obeying you, precisely, completely, and without interruption, every moment of every day. What it has been obeying is your actual signal. Not the one you wished you were broadcasting, not the one you described to yourself and others. The actual, dominant, habitual frequency of your inner life as it actually is, rather than as you have been presenting it to yourself. The conditions of your life are the testimony of your signal, and they have always been telling the truth. The question that remains, the only question that has ever mattered, is whether you are prepared to accept that testimony as information rather than as verdict, and to use it with the precision and honesty of a man who intends to change the broadcast. Make sure you are emitting the command you actually want answered. Think about this with the gravity it deserves. Every man is issuing a command. Every man's habitual inner life is a transmission, and every transmission is a command to which the universe is responding. The difference between men is not that some are commanding and others are not. All men command. The difference is that most men are commanding unconsciously, broadcasting the signal produced by their unexamined fears, their inherited assumptions, their habitual reactions, and their deepest unconsidered beliefs about what is available to them. And then experiencing the results of that unconscious command, as if they were the products of fate or chance rather than of signal and law. The work before you is the work of bringing your command into full conscious governance, of examining, with the discipline of a man who intends to take dominion over his own transmission, what signal you are actually emitting, and choosing, from this moment forward, to emit the one that corresponds to the life that is the genuine expression of your most developed and purposeful nature. Write in the comments, "I am the signal," not as a declaration of arrival, you may not yet be there. Not as an affirmation designed to make you feel better about where you currently stand, as a statement of intent, as the public acknowledgement of a private commitment to stop searching and begin transmitting, to take governance of the inner life, to purify the signal, to build the character that commands rather than pleads, and to hold the frequency of certainty steady under the pressure of conditions that have not yet caught up with the new broadcast. Write it as a man who has understood the law and accepted its terms. Write it as the beginning of the only work that has ever mattered. And begin the only broadcast that was ever yours to control. Not the broadcast of what you wish for, not the broadcast of what you have been told you deserve. The broadcast of what you genuinely are. When your inner life is brought into full alignment with the highest and most ordered version of your nature, that broadcast, clean, powerful, concentrated, and free of the noise of seeking, is the signal that the universe cannot fail to answer. It is the transmission that calls abundance home. It is the command that the formless substance has always been prepared to obey, waiting only for the transmitter to stop searching and start emitting the frequency that commands everything into its proper and inevitable place.